Some bands survive change. Fewer actually thrive through it. And rarer still are the ones who manage to split their own legacy clean down the middle, leaving two factions of devoted fans who will never quite agree on which half was the real thing. Van Halen is one of those bands, and the story of what happened after David Lee Roth walked out the door is one of the most complicated, contentious, and strangely moving chapters in rock history. This is not a story about a band falling apart. This is a story about a band reinventing itself, achieving massive commercial success, navigating tragedy, struggling with addiction, and ultimately finding a kind of quiet, private peace in its final hours. This is the Van Hagar era, and it deserves to be told in full. The world Van Halen left behind. To understand what Sammy Hagar was walking into in 1985, you have to understand what Van Halen had been just months before. The band that David Lee Roth fronted was a phenomenon, a leather-clad, high-kicking, party-first spectacle that had taken the entire decade by the throat. Roth was a showman in the old-school Hollywood sense, acrobatic, lewd, funny, impossible to ignore. And Eddie Van Halen was, by universal consensus, the greatest rock guitarist alive. Together, they had produced some of the most electric rock music ever committed to tape: Eruption, Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher. By 1984, they were selling out arenas worldwide, and their album of the same name had hit #2 on the Billboard charts. Everything seemed unstoppable. And then, almost overnight, it all fell apart. The reasons were many, and the fault lines had been building for years: creative disagreements, ego clashes, a growing rift between Roth's flashy showbiz instincts and Eddie's desire to be taken seriously as a musician. The final straw came during the recording of what would have been their next project together. Roth left, or was pushed out. Depending on who you ask, both things are true at the same time. The music press declared Van Halen finished. Without Diamond Dave, what were they, really? The answer, as it turned out, was still one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, just a very different one. Enter Sammy Hagar. Sammy Hagar was not an unknown when he got the call. He had fronted Montrose in the early 70s, a raw, punishing hard rock band that had laid some of the groundwork for what would become arena rock. He had gone solo after that and built a loyal following, most famously with I Can't Drive 55, a defiant, revving anthem that became one of the defining rock singles of 1984. He was a working musician with a proven track record, a powerful voice, and a reputation for being genuinely likable, which, given what Van Halen had just been through, was not a small thing. When Eddie Van Halen reached out, Hagar was cautious. He had his own career, his own identity. Joining a band that was either on the way up or in free fall, no one quite knew which, was a significant gamble. But he met with Eddie, the two connected immediately, and within days they were writing together. The chemistry was real and immediate in a way that surprised even them. What Hagar brought that Roth never had was vocal range, a genuine, expansive instrument that could sit above Eddie's most complex guitar work without being swallowed by it. Eddie had always been capable of more textured, layered, emotionally resonant compositions, but the band's earlier style had pulled toward bombast and spectacle. With Hagar, the door opened to something different, something that felt, to those who loved it, more grown up, and to those who hated it, more soft. 5150 and the shock of success. The debut album of the Hagar era, 5150, released in 1986, was named after the California legal code for an involuntary psychiatric hold, a choice that felt deliberately provocative for a band accused of losing its edge. It went to #1, their first ever chart topper.
Critics who had written the band off were forced to reckon with the fact that Van Halen with Hagar was not a diminished version of the band. It was a different band, and a wildly successful one. Why Can't This Be Love became an instant radio staple, its keyboard hook lodging itself in the brains of millions of listeners who had never once thought about Eddie Van Halen as a keyboardist. Love Walks In pushed even further into melodic, anthemic territory. Best of Both Worlds made a kind of philosophical statement. This band could hold its past and its new present simultaneously. The critics were divided, the fans were divided, but the charts were not. And for the next decade, Van Halen with Sammy Hagar would achieve a commercial consistency that even the Roth era, for all its iconic moments, had never quite managed. 4 number ones in a row. After 5150, the band released OU 812 in 1988, another number one. Then, for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, FUCK, as the acronym made unmistakably clear, in 1991, number one. Then Balance in 1995, number one again. 4 consecutive chart-topping albums. No other lineup of Van Halen before or after has come close to that record. For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge in particular stands as a high watermark of the era. Heavier, more guitar-forward than its predecessors, it gave Eddie room to stretch out in ways that felt aggressive and alive. Pound Cake opened with the sound of a power drill feeding through the guitar pickup. Right Now became one of the defining power ballads of the decade, its piano introduction and swelling chorus pairing with a music video of stark text and imagery that gave the song a weight it might not otherwise have carried. The album won a Grammy. The band, by any objective measure, was at the peak of its mainstream powers. And yet, below the surface, things were beginning to fracture.
Ed Leffler had managed both Sammy Hagar's solo career and Van Halen since the band's transition. He was, by all accounts, a steady hand, someone who understood both the creative tensions within the band and the business realities outside it. He was also, in the way that the best managers often are, a kind of emotional buffer between people who might otherwise tear each other apart. In 1993, Leffler died of thyroid cancer. He was 54 years old. The loss was personal as well as professional. Hagar had known Leffler for years before joining Van Halen. His death left a hole in the band's inner circle that was never properly filled. The management structure that followed was chaotic by comparison, and the band that had operated with relative smoothness for nearly a decade began to feel the strain. New management brought new priorities. The dynamic between the members, always complicated, became more so, and as the band moved into the mid-90s, the cracks were starting to show in ways that even the commercial success of Balance couldn't paper over. The Twister moment and the end. The split, when it finally came, was triggered by something almost absurdly small, a disagreement about a single line in a song written for the soundtrack to the 1996 disaster film Twister. The production company wanted changes made to the lyrics. Hagar refused. The band's management, now aligned more closely with the Van Halen brothers, pushed back on Hagar's position. What should have been a minor creative dispute became a flashpoint for every tension that had been building since Leffler's death. Hagar's account of events has shifted slightly over the years, but his core position has remained consistent. He felt ambushed, he felt unsupported, and he felt that the band he had given more than a decade of his life to had ultimately chosen contractual obligations over creative integrity. He quit, or was fired, depending again on who you ask. The timing was particularly painful. Balance had just been nominated for a Grammy. The band was still, commercially speaking, in excellent shape, and yet here they were, tearing themselves apart over a lyric for a movie about tornadoes. Rock and roll has always been good at finding ways to self-destruct at precisely the wrong moment. Van Halen in 1996 was no exception. The aftermath and the bitterness. What followed was a decade of low-grade mutual resentment. Van Halen briefly reunited with David Lee Roth, recorded a couple of new songs, and then almost immediately fell apart again. They tried Gary Cherone from Extreme as a replacement, an experiment that produced one album and left virtually everyone disappointed. Hagar, meanwhile, returned to solo work, started a successful residency in Cabo San Lucas, and launched a tequila brand that would eventually make him a great deal more money than rock and roll ever had. But the wounds from the split were not clean. In interviews over the years, Hagar said things about Eddie that were unkind. Eddie said things back. The Van Halen brothers, Eddie and drummer Alex, presented a unified front that often involved minimizing Hagar's contributions to the band's legacy. For fans who had grown up with 5150, or Right Now, or Finish What You Started, it was dispiriting to watch people who had made such music together seem to hold each other in such open contempt. The 2004 reunion and Eddie's decline. In 2004, Van Halen and Sammy Hagar reunited for a tour. On paper, it should have been a celebration. In practice, it was something more complicated and more troubling. Eddie Van Halen, by this point, was in serious trouble. His battle with tongue cancer, which he had spoken about publicly in the late 90s, attributing it in part to holding a metal guitar pick in his mouth for years, had left him physically diminished. His substance abuse issues, long a background concern among those close to him, had escalated. The man who had once seemed almost superhuman behind a guitar was now visibly struggling. Hagar has spoken with unusual candor about what the 2004 tour was really like. He describes watching his former bandmate deteriorate in real time, the shaking hands, the impaired coordination, the moments off stage that were hard to witness. He describes trying to hold the performances together while worrying genuinely about whether Eddie was going to make it through each show. There was money to be made, the tour was commercially successful, the crowds were enormous, but the human reality behind those sold-out arenas was not a triumphant one. It was, in Hagar's telling, one of the most difficult professional experiences of his life, not because of the music, but because of what he was watching happen to the person making it. The secret promise. And then there is the story that no one knew about, the one that only came to light after everything was already over. In the years that followed the 2004 reunion, Hagar and Eddie remained estranged. The public narrative was one of ongoing friction, competing accounts of the past, mutual grievance. But behind that public narrative, something unexpected happened. Through the intervention of a mutual friend, a comedian whose identity Hagar has disclosed in interviews, the two men found a way back to each other. There was a private meeting, a real conversation, not a press release, not a managed reconciliation for the cameras, but two people sitting together and talking honestly about the years they had shared and the years that had gone wrong. Eddie had a dream. He called it the Kitchen Sink Tour, a final run that would bring together everyone who had ever been part of Van Halen's story. Not a nostalgia exercise, not a money grab, a proper send-off, a chance for the band, in all its complicated, fractured, beautiful mess, to say goodbye on its own terms. He made Hagar promise to keep the plan secret. Specifically, he made him promise not to tell Alex. Why? That part has never been fully explained. Perhaps Eddie knew that Alex would shut the idea down. Perhaps he wanted to control the reveal himself. Perhaps it was simply the kind of private, protective gesture that people make when they are not sure they have the strength to fight for something and need to keep it safe a little longer. Whatever the reason, Hagar made the promise, and he kept it. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, of a stroke, with cancer that had spread to his brain. The Kitchen Sink Tour never happened. The promise was kept until there was no longer anyone left to keep it from. Cabo Wabo and the Other Life.
One of the things that gets lost in the Van Halen narrative, consumed as it tends to be by the Roth versus Hagar argument, is how extraordinarily successful Sammy Hagar became outside of music entirely. Cabo Wabo Tequila began as a brand connected to his club in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, a place Hagar had fallen in love with in the 80s and made into something of a second home. The tequila was local, unpretentious, and genuinely good. Hagar believed in it not as a celebrity endorsement product, but as a real business. He built it carefully, expanded distribution methodically, and cultivated a brand identity that felt authentic rather than manufactured. In 2007, he sold a majority stake in Cabo Wabo to the Campari Group for roughly $80 million. By the time the remaining stake was sold, the total figure was approaching $100 million. For a rock musician who had spent the late 90s being publicly dismissed as a has-been, it was a remarkable vindication and a reminder that the skills that make someone good at one thing do not always stay neatly within the original container.
Hagar has since launched additional spirits ventures, including Sammy's Beach Bar Rum. His business instincts have proved, if anything, more consistently successful than his music career, which itself produced 4 #1 albums, so the bar was already high. Alex's book and the erasure. In 2024, Alex Van Halen published a memoir. He called it Brothers, a title that telegraphed its priorities clearly enough. The book was by all accounts a deeply personal account of growing up with Eddie, of the bond between the two brothers, of what it meant to share a life and a career with someone that close. The Van Hagar era does not appear in it, not meaningfully. 11 years of the band's history, 4 #1 albums, sold-out world tours, a Grammy win, reduced to an absence, a gap in the timeline that a casual reader might not even notice. Hagar noticed. His response has been measured but clear. He does not understand the omission. He does not accept it as a neutral editorial choice. He views it as a deliberate act of historical revision, a decision to erase a chapter of the band's story because it does not fit the narrative that Alex has chosen to tell about his brother and himself. Whether Alex's intent was malicious or simply personal is something only he can answer. Memoirs are by definition selective. They're not encyclopedias. A man writing about his brother is under no obligation to give equal weight to every chapter of a career that brother shared with someone else. But the effect of that omission is real, and Hagar's frustration with it is understandable. The Van Hagar era is not a footnote. It is, by most measurable standards, the most commercially successful period in the band's entire history. Pretending otherwise does not make it less true. It just makes the pretending more conspicuous. The relationship that remains. Hagar and Alex Van Halen do not have a warm relationship. That much is public knowledge. The friction between them did not begin with the memoir. It has been present in various forms for decades. Alex was the person Eddie wanted kept in the dark about the kitchen sink tour. Alex was the one who, in Hagar's account, helped push him out of the band in 1996. Alex is the surviving half of the founding partnership, and he is the keeper of a particular version of Van Halen's legacy. That version does not have much room for Sammy Hagar in it, and Hagar, who is now in his late 70s and still performing, has had to come to terms with the fact that the chapter of his life he spent in one of the world's biggest rock bands may never be fully acknowledged by the people who were there alongside him. It is a strange kind of grief, not for a person exactly, but for a shared history that one party has chosen to treat as if it barely happened. What the music actually was. Strip away the drama, the lawsuits, the feuds, the tequila empire, the memoir, the promises made to dying men in private rooms. Strip all of that away, and what you are left with is the music. And the music, taken on its own terms, holds up. Why Can't This Be Love is a perfect pop rock single. When It's Love is a genuinely affecting ballad. Finish What You Started has a looseness and a groove that the early band rarely attempted. Pound Cake is as aggressive and inventive as anything Eddie ever recorded. Right Now is the kind of song that lodges itself in a generation's memory and stays there, not because it was pushed hard enough by a record label, but because it earned its place. Eddie Van Halen is on every one of these recordings. His fingerprints are everywhere. The notion that the Hagar era was somehow a lesser expression of his talent does not survive close listening. If anything, the expanded harmonic territory that Hagar's voice opened up pushed Eddie into some of the most nuanced playing of his career. He was doing things on balance that he could not have done on Van Halen 1. Not because he had gotten better at the mechanics, but because the musical context had grown to accommodate a different kind of expression. Great musicians evolve. The ones who don't are usually the ones who get called classics, while their later work quietly disappears. Eddie Van Halen's later work, made with Sammy Hagar, dismissed by half the fan base, erased from one brother's memoir, is some of the best music he ever made. The Van Hagar era lasted 11 years. It produced 4 consecutive #1 albums. It survived the death of a beloved manager, the escalating health crisis of the band's central creative force, a bitter and public split, a difficult reunion, and a private reconciliation that the world only heard about after it was too late to mean what it might have meant. Sammy Hagar went on to build a business empire, to keep performing, to keep telling his version of the story, because someone needs to, and because the alternative is to let that story be swallowed by a silence he did not choose. Alex Van Halen wrote a book about his brother and left 11 years out of it. Whatever that choice says about grief or loyalty or the way people protect the stories that matter most to them, it does not change what happened. It does not change what was recorded, what was sold, what was played in arenas across the world, what was felt by the people who were in those arenas. Eddie Van Halen died with a dream of one last tour and a promise that no one could keep anymore. He died having made peace, quietly and privately, with the person he had spent a decade fighting. That matters. In the grand, chaotic, improbable story of Van Halen, it might be the part that matters most. The music is still there. It will outlast all of this. It always does.